report ready by our date at the end of the month. So we're going to have to cancel it and redo it for July. I'll put a posting to that effect on the site when I post this as well. The issue is that the target for us, target release date, predicates our deterministic search for context categories, companies, corporate activities, and these kind of things. So the report released in July would be kind of useless because it's most of the stuff would have happened. And so what we have to do is we have to basically redo the data run and target the end of July for a release that would then be applicable for August and September. And we are indeed going to try that, setting that up now. We've had a number of difficult days here at Half Past Human, and so the decision is just made that it's too much stress, it's not going to be able to be done on time in an adequate fashion, and I don't really like releasing anything that's just basically half-assed. So it was probably at this point we've already been in a position of changing or chasing time, and I've had to discard maybe a quarter of everything that had been produced. It's the nature of immediacy data. So instead, what I'm doing now is sitting out and sitting on the deck and using a handheld device to record the immediacy data intelligence report that would have followed the pirate report, because I can get that done today and get it out of the way, and I've had a number of requests for it. So let's start again, so to speak, and begin that. Today's immediacy data intelligence report is focused for the month of July and August, a little bit into the fall. It was prepared on data sets that ran immediacy data type, primarily shorter term to about 30% and about 18% longer term. These data types, or the data gathering stopped about, 4 days ago, and so we're within the window of some of the immediacy data stuff actually occurring. Our immediacy data's most startling thing that came out of it, we can just use as the title for this particular report, and we'll call it Antarctica and the Flying Nazi Economy. Flying Nazis Economy. So let's first acknowledge we've got to do some housekeeping here, and I'll explain a bit of what's going on, and then I'll get into the data, and then we'll do a wrap-up. I need to. I don't know whether I'll have a chance here to get some of the pictures, just random pictures I've got, and a little bit of video, but I'm going to give it a shot. It takes a little while to render all of that, and we're just really pressed on time on a lot of things here. But one thing for sure is that if you don't get this immediacy data intelligence report off of the Clif YouTube channel or off of Half Past Human, you need to stop and examine and see if it's been altered. There have been a number of reports of this. I've found that indeed there are people that are stripping the audio component out of the videos that I've made for YouTube, re-engineering them, and making some alterations. So just be advised. Basically, it's an authentication issue. So the pirate report is, as a matter of formal housekeeping, will be targeted for August. It'll be brought out probably sometime around the beginning of the third week in July. That gives us enough of a leeway to slip a few days as the universe intrudes. Igor has been relocated. He's in a nice, secure spot. He really likes it. He and his wife are settling in. He's actually on the road this weekend, picking up the last of the server gear and associated air conditioners and all that kind of crud. And we'll be back in his new environments next week. Anyway, he's doing fine. Now, I have to also acknowledge that donations have been extremely generous, staggeringly so, but they do not cover our costs. I just don't have enough of a listener base for that to be viable, I think, is the issue. The costs that we run on this are quite sizable, absent any of the time put into software tuning and that sort of thing. When I think about it here, it's probably been maybe January of this year was the last time that I really had any sort of actual compensation for the amount of time that we've put in. And at that level, we're just not making. I mean, we're far below minimum wage. You know, I shouldn't put it that way, or the government will come on in here and make me do something. But that is the case. It's not a big deal for us. Kathy and I live sort of like retired college kids anyway, so there isn't a whole lot of stress on us that way. But I can't support the costs on this. We can keep going for maybe one more intelligence report here after this one. As a side effect, so to speak, of aiming to produce the pirate report. And we've got enough of an understanding that there should be enough sales there to support our actual costs out of pocket. And as long as it doesn't drain me of cash at this critical time, is not a big deal to keep it going, simply because I'm waiting for certain events to mature here, like the finishing of the boat and a few other things to happen before certain changes have to occur. I'm not trying to sound mysterious. I just don't want to get into all the damn details. Take too long. Basically, what I'm waiting for is a number of situations to reach a point of maturity where it would make sense for me to act. And some of these are on their way, such as the boats getting done, and so that allows us to, for instance, move easier. Because we don't have to move the boat in pieces. We can take it as a whole, and then we just move the tools, that sort of thing. So I'm dealing with those kind of issues at the same time that we're dealing with grander memes going on within the social order, and I'm waiting for some of those to reach a point of maturity before acting as well. So that's just kind of a heads up, guys. We're going to do this next private report. If it goes well and meets our cost well, then we can re-examine in August as to where we're at. I think I can do one more of these audio-video report things between now and the release date for that. I'll certainly keep it in mind as I go along. My time is being consumed by the needs of people and circumstances around me, so I can't guarantee that. All right, so that's sort of housekeeping on our end here. Real quick, let me just run through the data types so that we can get that issue resolved. Immediacy data is targeted for 3 days from the time that we make the forecast of it. And the immediacy data has an effective range out to about the end of the 3rd week. Now, it has an error range that large, but with immediacy data, the error range is usually within 3 days. It tends to shade down towards the lower end of the range. Unlike longer-term data, where the error rate tends to move towards the longer term of the range, which is about 3 years. In any event, though, the immediacy data is harvested and processed and then interpreted, and those interpretation or those memes that we find that are worth pursuing are then re-examined within the next stream of immediacy data to look for these changes, and then those changes give us an idea of the direction the forecast is going to take, and so on. And then we make an interpretation, and I make one of these reports. Usually the time is no more than 5 or 6 days from that last harvest of immediacy data, because sometimes the immediacy data is harvested right when things are popping, as now. So, for instance, I could, prepare this report, get it posted, and find that 5 minutes before I got the thing uploaded, because it took an hour and a half to render and 2.5 hours to get uploaded, that a third of everything happened. So that's what we call chasing time, where the events are actually accelerating rapidly towards us, and we're trying to get out a level of a forecast about the immediacy data. One of the reasons I'm not really fond of immediacy data is that there is that pressure, that stress. And it's caught us many times with a forecast that I've had to throw out of a report simply because it had already occurred. And sometimes these forecasts are quite detailed and take some number of hours to develop. So, again, I'm not really a fan of immediacy data. I much prefer working with the shorter term and longer term. Shorter term picks up from the end of the 3rd week and goes out to the end of the 3rd month. Again, its error range is that entire range, so about 4 months potentially, but with the shorter term, it has a tendency to error into the shorter end of the range. Longer term is from the beginning of the 4th month out through 19 months, but it has a trickle-out effect on the long term that will reach out 3 years. So we have to be aware of that. And most of the errors within the longer-term data tend to peak about the peak of a standard bell curve, which puts it within this particular setup, because it's based over 36 months, puts it a little bit over half of that 19-month range. And not to get too confusing, that is its potential for error. So it's quite possible that something that was forecast based on long-term data won't show up for a year and a half after it was supposed to. It makes us look like doofuses, but sometimes, again, it turns out to be just really prescient in terms of all the words we use and so on. We're just off by a year, you know. Okay, so that's the nature of the data sets. Entities are basically what you would think of in terms of object-oriented programming. These are bags or collections, mimetic and thematically linked and related data that is not necessarily temporally linked. So an entity, for instance, spans time, stays reasonably cohesive. An entity might, you can get it down to a really small level. A small bag or a collection might be, say, you could create an entity that was basically focused on all the words around the Republicans and the Democrats, the right or left, Labor, Tory, whatever you want to, some other, whatever split you want. I prefer not to look at data at that fine level of granularity. It's less than meaningful. Has a tendency to get really emotionally hot all the time, so there isn't much in the way of nuance from which to make a forecast. But it gives you an idea of what an entity could be down at a lower level. Our entities are very large. The most stable ones, oddly enough, across time have turned out to be the markets and Space Goat Farts entity. Space Goat Farts is basically all of the data sets around unknown or conspiracy theory that keep popping up all the time. And if you link any of these things together around that, you get this giant entity that I called Space Goat Farts. This is from the mutant giant space goats that use their farts as their method of propulsion from star system to star system, because they're second level of thermodynamics law reactive entities. Anyway, so that's where we are. Okay, so housekeeping and stuff aside, here we are. June 22nd is coming up. That was the day that we pegged for the first real action on the part of Russia relative to the boiling pot of chaos that is Ukraine. We may or may not be surprised by what occurs there in terms of when and how accurate the June 22nd peg is. The outcome is already forecast as sort of a clean sweep for the Russians, and a lot of big sighs of relief after that stuff's done. I need to make a note that some of the language that we'd forecast for Max Kaiser relative to woo-woo science fiction and Daleks is showing up today. He didn't use the word Daleks, he used machines. This was in a report posted today, Kaiser Report 617, I believe. The machine language was repetitious and every bit of what we were expecting on part of the machine stuff. There were a couple of references to the sci-fi part, but only two. So I'm still waiting for the visuals. There's indication that there was going to be an in-his-face visual kind of a component to this. He's going to go truck about. Maybe he'll actually run into Daleks or UFOs or some damn thing on his trip. But in any event, we're starting to see some of the language appear. So it is as forecast in June, and I suspect that the rest of it is going to play out over summer, and it's going to end up being quite the discussed thing if the data sets are correct. Very interesting the way the language was used. Presumably Max has, he's a self-directed, self-actualizing human, and so has no... and it has absolutely no reason whatsoever to listen to my bullshit, and certainly is unaware of the nuances and the individual kinds of language that are forecast, and so couldn't be in any way manipulated by us to produce that language. Nor will his whatever in the face turns out to be able to be anything other than an actual forecast of an event that occurs that's just too far off in terms of too out there. To be anything other than an accurate or semi-accurate description of a manifestation. based on our technology. Basically, I'm saying, if the rest of the language manifests as it did in this past first quarter of this year when Max had his UFO encounter, which we forecast by about 3 or 4 weeks ahead of that occurring. But if the rest of the language appears, this is a pretty good claim to fans saying, hey, it's not chance. Our accuracy rate can be quite good sometimes. Anyway, so on to other items here. We expect that the precious metals will really start taking off, silver leading, after whatever occurs on July 7th pops off. It's shown in our data sets as dragging away the gate, opening up the corral, knocking down the fence, destroying the walls of the fort, whatever, unleashing energies, however you want to think about it. And so the precious metals really take off in July. Anything prior to that, according to our data sets, are basically you could think of as all of the horses milling around in the corral getting ready for the corral gate to be thrown down because they know it's coming. And so any rise or ascent in the prices of the precious metals as may occur prior to July 7th in our data sets is seen as basically getting ready for the big step up. Not something to be particularly concerned about because it's relatively minor compared to what's coming. Been wrong before, but some of our precious metal things in terms of timing are really popping off now, so maybe we're accurate on this. I'm just as an aside, I may or may not end up with a silver option that gets into the money here for July because it closes on the last day of the on June 25th, which is within our 3-day error rate for the silver forecast. So if not, we'll be close, And so again, it would be another validation of the strategy that I picked relative to what the data was telling me some months back. So basically, guys, if you get a chance to buy silver after July, you'll realize why your head hurts. It's because you've been slapping yourself upside the head saying, why didn't I buy more when it was cheap? So anyway, so there's that. So precious metals take off in July in a serious way. They keep going through August, according to our data. We'll have more details on individual commodities and regions and producers in the July report. A lot of what you're going to see happen in July, I think, will relate to the visibility level of investigators for the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, and that these guys and the government guys in China will hit Shanghai as the infinite rehypothecation of assets scandal goes systemic within the Chinese social order. It's not going to end well it'll end well for China because they're going to clean house, and they'll end up having to go through a reformation period that's going to occupy the rest of this year and probably a good section of next year, maybe even 3/4 of next year. And it's going to help them out. But this the rest of this year is going to be very nasty relative to some of the things that they discover in the ramifications for the Chinese social order are not they don't indicate a lot of stability. There's going to be some real problems that will result as from this. However, as per usual, you'll find a few bankers that will actually lose their heads over this. Anyway, so that's precious metals. And by the way, some of the words around the July 7th precious metals or movement relative to the cross-links that go over to the precious metals relate to the word revival, as though a market revived. Now there's cross-links from there over to the bond bust that's going to occur throughout this summer and into the fall in a serious way. The bonds were discussed on the Max Kaiser show today. Again, staggering amount of the language that I'd forecast that I've got in these little lists around here. And so we're getting close to the collapse of the bond market, and it's going to lead to this period of time where we have the caught outward showing up. Now, I've had arguments with guys who are in various different forms of trading, and they say you're caught out if you miss the trade. But there's another interpretation that I think is more common, and that's the one we're using here, where people in the trading business in Wall Street, people that will have, quote, wealth involved in some form of digital currency will be caught out in their inability to get that wealth extracted from whatever, quote, institution it's in as the system starts to crumble. And it's going to lock up vast quantities of digital wealth and prevent it from going home, if you will. So it yet remains to see which part of this scenario will play out, and we indeed may see the traders feeling that they've been caught out as precious metals take off in July or something, some kind of other trade that really takes their attention away from things. And they may feel that that's the case, but I think in terms of the longer-term data, my explanation, my definition of it is much more likely to end up being the one that shows up by the end of the year. But again, we'll see. So it's a bet on whether or not you'd be able to make money in any kind of a trade, take that money and convert it into a form of real wealth other than digital by the end of the year, according to our data. Now, speaking towards that, we've got a number of data sets that are going towards the idea that this summer a trial balloon is going to be launched. In fact, we're saying it'll occur here. I'm saying it'll occur here likely before July, let's say July 20th, probably likely before July 15th. And it's going to be a trial balloon set up in the North America by the guys who run the GUS, government U.S., and they're going to launch the idea of a bifurcated currency. That is to say, a dollar that's split, that there's two kinds of dollars, internal dollars and external dollars. And if you deal with them outside the U.S., you use external currency dollars, and if you deal with them inside the U.S., all of us guys use a new form of a dollar that gets basically a huge level of devaluation. Now, the data sets say that this plan is complete in terms of it's, well thought out. They've got all the T's crossed and the I's dotted and all of that kind of stuff, and all of the details rigged up. However, it doesn't show anything indicating that it would be successful. There's a lot to indicate that just the announcement of the consideration of the bifurcated currency and its impact on international trade is going to cause something of a problem that will ripple through GUS and its minor international arms over the course of August and into September, and that these ripples that are being caused by this bifurcated currency idea are going to participate in the systemic upheaval or lockdown or seizure, depending on how you want to think about it, that occurs in September, that leads to the hyperinflation and the rest of the real problems that take us into what will become a glorious period of 2015 to 2020. Really going to be a lot of damn change over the next 5 years. Nothing this year is going to prepare you for the level of that change. We're going to see, well, I won't go into the long-term data. We've got to get moving on the rest of this. Okay, so in August, we've got data sets that go towards the idea of a water poisoning, giant water poisoning. The way I'm interpreting this, because of the nature of the data, is that there's a giant bolus, a giant, huge ball of fresh water that enters the ocean. And I think it'll either be the Pacific Ocean or, in this order, either Pacific, Southern Ocean, or Indian Ocean, the South Indian Ocean. It's in a very distant place with not a lot of observers, but it will, according to the data sets, it will be picked up by satellites, and boats will see it and cause all kinds of problems. And will be a very unique sort of a thing, and, the ocean will be, that area will be basically traumatized when this occurs. Now, here's our problem and our issue with the interpretation. We also have a number of other data sets that relate this via crosslink over to Antarctica. So, are we looking at an under-the-seas volcano that opens up and spews out super hot fresh water or super hot sulfurated water or something in the middle of the ocean in a Yellowstone kind of fashion and releases such quantity that it poisons a significant portion of the ocean? Or are we looking at a major tear in the ice skirt around Antarctica that allows hundreds and hundreds of millions of tons of fresh water to be pressurized out between the ice shelf and the underlying continent? Either of these would fulfill the conditions relative to the poisoning of the ocean, and either of these would, or both of them, actually would have the Antarctic connection. Now, it's in the middle of the ocean scenario with an undersea volcano opening up and pumping out large quantities of, quote, fresh water, non-saline water. That's going to, basically, if it's got an Antarctic connection, it's also going to participate in what is described in our data sets as the shifting of the ice. This is cross-connected to markets, oddly enough, where we have a similar phrase showing up called shift of ages, meaning basically a massive damn thing occurring that doesn't occur even necessarily within a given lifetime. And so it's something that's occurring in a multiple lifetime scenario. That's very rare, actually, to see to live in such a time that you go through a 2 or 3 or 400 year cycle, completing or beginning such that you're able to pay attention to it. And it's even more so if we're talking about something like the rupture of the skirt around Antarctica and the release of that ice, because that would be on the order of an 11 or 12,000 year cyclic event. Not that that's unexpected because of where we're at in space and in time. So the interpretation at this stage has to be somewhat loose in the sense that either of those could fulfill the language we've got. At the moment, there's just an ever so slight preponderance of language suggesting that it's a bolus of water coming up out of the middle of the ocean bed. It remains to be seen if that's accurate or not. The slight preponderance is less than 1% of overall supporting data types, and it's less than 11% based on emotive sums. So it doesn't, and it's growing. Both sets are continue to grow, so we're in a situation where it's rather fluid, pun intended. So anyway, here we are. There's a further thing about the Antarctic, though. When we go on over to the sets that are cross-connected to Antarctica within the space goat farts, and there's a big rope of them that go that are geographically related to Antarctica that are housed within the space goat fart entity. And when we go over there, the rising and both the primary support and the rising support in the secondary and tertiary levels all relate to the idea of flying Nazis. It's actually more than that, because if we get into the third level of support down there, we have flying Nazis economy. And if I just, were totally crazy, I'd say, okay, well, here's what the data is saying. The data is saying that there's there's a huge Nazi economy under the ice in Antarctica, being warmed by warm water. There's going to be a Earth shift. The Antarctic skirt's going to break. All that water's going to go away. The Nazis are going to be at risk of being crushed, and they're going to come on out in their flying machines and bring their economy with them. And boy, now that's a space goat part. So that's where we're going to have to leave it. Again, not being attempting to be any more mysterious than we have to. It's just where we're at these days. So if you happen to see some flying Nazis bringing their economy with them in August, and actually it's a longer-term data set. It can appear over the next 19 or 20 months. Most of the stuff about the Nazis, per se, is indeed within the longer term and the far end of the shorter term. So I wouldn't expect it to show up in August. But that's where the leading edge of the growth is for that particular subset of the entities, including Space Goat Farts, markets, and the Terra entity that shows the shift of ages, in its form being the shift of the ice off Antarctica. And it's curious for us whenever we get similar data sets showing up in disparate bags or collections that we call entities, because it has a tendency to make us go, bye, y'all. Whoops, sorry about that. I don't even follow my own damn advice. Some people will recognize when they hear this. Okay, last little bit. Sorry about that. I'd forgotten it. This is our commercial message. If you're on a fixed income, please do not send us any kind of money or anything. Save it for yourself. It's going to get really horrific here, especially in the latter half of this year. But you can do us the courtesy of subscribing if you haven't already. Just to let us know that basically it's a form of the word habu, which is encouragement to the storyteller. So if you can just subscribe, that gives us the feeling, okay, we're not alone out here. And it also gets Igor off my back, who's got a particular number he's reaching for. I won't go into that until some other time. Anyway, so if you can, that's great. If you can send us a few dollars, they would not go amiss. We're in need. But like I say, if you're on a fixed income, basically if you're as poor as we are, the subscription is more than enough. Maybe tell your friends, pass it around on Google Plus and that kind of thing. Get a little whipped up about it, put energy into it rather than money. And that would be tremendous help. No question. And yeah, Joe. Yes.